Over the past couple of decades, I've done a good deal of speaking about justice. I've often encountered resistance, especially when the audience has consisted mainly of Christians. Almost invariably, somebody in the question period afterwards will emphatically declare that the Christian gospel is about love, not about justice. Others, if my ear tells me correctly, seem to equate a concern for justice with the desire to destroy individual freedom and free market economy and to replace it with some kind of socialist arrangement. Others seem to equate a concern for justice with liberal Christianity. It has struck me that maybe there's still some lingering cultural memory of the social gospel movement in liberal Christian churches of the 1920s. Whether cultural memories can last that long, I don't actually know. This negative attitude toward justice by Christians is reflected, I would say, in the fact that whereas most churches have benevolence committees, very few have social justice or social action committees. It's reflected in the fact that the Christian Reformed Church had a World Relief Committee long before it had a counterpart Justice Committee. And in the fact that the latter, the Justice Committee, so I'm told, is the subject of a good deal more suspicion than the World Relief Committee. It's reflected in the comment by the theologian Stanley Hauerwas that, and I quote Stanley, "Justice is a bad idea for Christians." Though I should add that when you carefully read what Hauerwas, the context there, he doesn't quite mean what those words mean and what most people, I think, who don't read them carefully take them as meaning. When I go on in my talks to explain that in my view, justice is connected to rights, I encounter even more resistance. Again, especially though not only among Christians, invariably get the response, hey, look, we should be talking about responsibility, not about rights. Too many people in this society think they're entitled to things. For several years, Claire and I have spent the school year connected to an institute at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And this past year, there was a car regularly parked in the parking lot of our apartment complex with a bumper sticker saying, "You are entitled to nothing." A couple of weeks ago, in an interview on television, the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, said, and I quote, "If you tell me it's a right, then you tell me what I have to do." Obviously, he didn't want to be told what he had to do. And about 15 years ago, when I was talking about justice and rights up in a church in Edmonton, a dear friend, Clarence, that's his actual name, but you don't know who Clarence was, so that's okay. Clarence got up in the question period afterwards, and with a quiver in his voice, I think probably because he's disagreeing with a good friend anyway, with a quiver in his voice, he said with great intensity, "Nick, we have no rights. It's grace all the way down." More recently, over the past decade, so it seems to me, more recently there have been stirrings in the opposite direction. An organization located in Bend, Oregon, has held 3 every other year conferences that they simply call the Justice Conference. The first conference, which I did not attend, was held in Portland, Oregon. The second at which I spoke was held in Bend, Oregon. And to my utter astonishment, there were 1,100 attendees, the average age of whom appeared to me to be, 26, 27, something like that. And this last January, the third conference was held, the third Justice Conference, this time in Philadelphia's gigantic convention center. Again, I spoke, and this time there were 5,000 attendees. Again, the average age struck me as 26, 27, thereabouts. For several years now, the students in the International Development Program at Calvin College have organized on their own, without faculty assistance or direction or anything of the sort, on their own, a conference on justice to which they invite students from the other Christian colleges in the country. It's been terrifically successful. And to mention just one more thing, I can mention lots of things, including ASJ. There's a network of MICA centers around the world with a very active MICA center here in Grand Rapids. So especially among young people, there's something stirring. Every now and then I hear a dismissive comment about these stirrings. It's a fad, the critics say. It's all talk and no action. Time will tell whether it's a fad, but it's just not true that it's all talk. Just pay attention to the activities of the MICA Center here in Grand Rapids, to the activities of ASJ, to the activities of, for example, the International Justice Mission, IJM. So in thinking about this talk tonight, I thought, I shouldn't just repeat what I've said on other occasions or written on other occasions. It should be slightly different, at least. So I've decided to do this. In the situation of some Christians resisting talk about justice and rights, and other Christians, especially young ones, exceedingly enthusiastic about the struggle for justice, I decided that maybe the best contribution I could make would be to talk about what justice is and why it's important. The first thing to note, it seems to me, is that there are two different kinds of justice. One kind is often called retributive or criminal justice. I prefer calling it corrective justice. I don't want to call it retributive because I think Jesus forbids retribution. I'll get to that later. And I don't want to call it criminal because corrective justice goes well beyond criminal justice. There are two fundamentally different kinds of justice, and one I'm going to call corrective justice. Corrective justice is the kind of justice that becomes relevant when somebody has to be, or should be, corrected because they've wronged somebody, because they've treated somebody unjustly, because there's been a breakdown in justice. But if that's correct, that corrective justice becomes relevant when there's been a breakdown in justice, then corrective justice obviously cannot be the only form of justice. There has to be that form that broke down such that now corrective justice is relevant. And I'm going to call that other form of justice primary justice. When the people of color in South Africa were resisting the system of apartheid, they were not calling for a better prison system, though they certainly thought that there were substantial improvements to be made in the prison system. But in their opposition to apartheid, they were insisting that in being shuffled around as they were being denied primary justice. So primary justice. When that breaks down, then corrective justice becomes relevant. So let me begin with, in a way, the reverse order. Corrective justice rather than primary justice, partly because even those Christians I've discovered who say they don't like the idea of justice, in fact, when you talk further, they've got no problem with corrective justice. How they fit that together, I don't exactly know. Now, a well-functioning system of criminal justice, corrective justice, is absolutely indispensable to human existence. Our American system of criminal justice has lots of glitches and defects in it. We don't think much about it. If somebody has burglarized your house, you report it to the police, and you expect the police to do something about it, try to find out who did it. And if they do find out who did it, you expect the judicial system to some kind of punishment. We just take the system for granted. And what catches our attention in that situation is the glitches, the breakdowns, naturally. My eyes were opened to what I'd been taking for granted without even thinking about it. When 3 years ago I went to Tegucigalpa, Honduras, to visit the work of ASJ. Now there are two different sets of initials here. ASJ is the acronym for the Spanish, and AJS is the acronym for the English, Association for a More Just Society. In Spanish, that gets reversed. I'm going to call it by the Spanish acronym, ASJ, okay? ASJ is the co-sponsor is the sponsor for this talk. One of the founders of ASJ had for a good many years, every summer, called me up, took me out for coffee, urged me to come down to Honduras to visit the work of ASJ. And finally, as we say, I was without excuse, so I went. The opportunity opened up. Let me tell you some of what I observed. Some have heard me talk about this, some have read what I've written about it before, so put up with me. Honduras is rife with crime against the poor. It is one of the highest murder rates in the world. Maybe, in fact, the highest murder rate. Now, it's commonly said that the reason that the system is so ineffective in Honduras in dealing with crime, especially crime against the poor, is due to corruption of the police officials and so forth. Kurt Verbeek and his colleagues at ASJ agree that there's a lot of corruption in the system, but I found it very interesting to hear them say that the basic problem, in their opinion, was not corruption, but fear and a pervasive lack of trust. Poor people do not trust the police, the judicial system, or the bureaucracy. The police don't trust the prosecutors, and the prosecutors don't trust the police, and so forth. And the result is that the poor are afraid to take action when they are the victims of crime. They fear that if they file a report with the police will report it to the perpetrators, and the perpetrators will get even with them. Or the police fear that the perpetrators will avenge themselves on the police. So everybody's afraid of everybody. Nobody trusts anybody. And there's a lot of evidence that all these fears are justified. It turns out that the laws of Honduras are pretty good. It's the implementation of the laws, that's the enforcement of the laws, that breaks down. This was, let me just say, an eye-opener for me. We middle-class people in Grand Rapids live in a system where if your house is burglarized, you report to the police, you expect the police to do something about it. You don't expect retribution for burglars and so forth. This was revelatory. So in such a situation, what's to be done? ASJ has a number of major projects. I'm going to describe one of them, namely the Peace and Justice Project. There's other projects like getting corruption out of the school system and so forth. So ASJ has targeted two sizable areas of Tegucigalpa, impoverished areas, one of about 30,000 inhabitants and the other of about 70,000 inhabitants, as places where it is going to stand alongside the victims of violent crime as part of its Peace and Justice Project. When the police refuse or decline to investigate crime, whether because of fear of reprisal, lack of resources, or whatever, ASJ has stepped in itself to conduct investigations and itself to assist the prosecutors in preparing criminal cases. And when victims of crime are afraid to report crime or afraid to testify in court, ASJ steps to protect them. And on that last point, I learned a very interesting thing. ASJ makes use of recourse available in Honduran law of what are called protected witnesses. Witnesses to a crime appear in court hooded from top to bottom. Their voices are technologically altered, and they testify. So there can't be retribution because their identity is not known. This is not possible in Anglo-Saxon law. The work is dangerous, as Peter hinted. One of the lawyers who was one of their lead investigators, their lead investigator at the time, Dionisio, was shot, killed at point-blank range on a busy street in Tegucigalpa. On one day of my visit, the ASJ workers took me and some other North Americans who were visiting out into one of the neighborhoods where the Peace and Justice Project was at work. We crowded into a small private living room. As I remember, about 8 victims of crime were present in that small room. They described what had happened to them, how impossible it had been to get the police to do anything, how scared they were to report it, until ASJ stepped in and assisted them, protected them, and so forth. It was a really moving experience. Never forget it, this tiny, hot living room. At the time of my visit, the Peace and Justice Project had been working in these areas for about 6 years, and it had played a significant role in the conviction of more than 100 perpetrators of crime in those 6 years. Homicides in the targeted areas had been reduced from 42 in 2005 to 9 in 2009, while at the same time, the murder rate in Honduras generally had been increasing rapidly. So ASJ is a wonderful and unusual organization. It's not a relief organization. It's not a development organization. It's a justice organization. But it's a justice organization of quite a different sort, for example, from the International Justice Mission, which concerns itself with sex trafficking. Peace and Justice Project. ASJ is dealing with corrective justice. Some of its other projects, it's dealing with primary justice. But it's also not a movement for prison reform. The way to think of it, I guess, is that it steps in before the prison. It tries to get the laws enforced. The implicit assumption in everything it does is that the task of government, or one of the fundamental tasks of government, is to secure justice in society by instituting a system of just laws, by effectively and justly enforcing those laws, and by meting out justice to those who violate them. And this, it seems to me, is exactly what St. Paul says is the business of government in Romans 13. To secure justice in society. ASJ tries to prod and assist the Honduran government to do what government is supposed to do, effectively and justly apply a system of laws. And sometimes it's gutsy and courageous, sometimes it's humble. Turns out that sometimes prosecutors say, well, I don't have a car to drive out to the neighborhood to investigate this afternoon. So ASJ says, oh, look, we've got a car. We'll lend it to you for the afternoon. Now, before we leave this topic of corrective justice, let me say just a word about what I take corrective justice to be. I'll be brief, maybe too brief. As I mentioned earlier, corrective justice is commonly described as retributive justice. And the criminal justice system is commonly thought of and spoken about as a retributive justice system. I've come to the view, unexpectedly, I guess I have to say, I've come to the view that the New Testament forbids retribution. Retribution is payback, imposing harm as an answer to harm, evening things up, repaying harm with harm. In the Sermon on the Mount, if you don't believe it, read the end of Matthew 5. Believe me. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus forbids payback. Do not return evil for evil, he says. And Paul says the same thing towards the end of Romans 12. Do not repay evil with evil. Repay evil with good. I see no way around the conclusion that retribution is not allowed. Does this mean that punishment is out? It does not. When a parent punishes her child for something he has done, the parent doesn't think of that as payback, as getting even, as tit for tat. Parenthesis, or if the parent does think of it like that, there's something profoundly sick and amiss in the relationship of the parent to the child. So how does the parent think of what the parent is doing? I would say is reproving the child, expressing her profound disapproval of what was done, in the hope that the child will not do it again. I've coined the word reprobative to name this understanding of punishment. Reprobative versus retributive. I think the Christian understanding of punishment has to be a reprobative understanding. My guess, for what it's worth, there are people in this room who could say much better than I can. My guess is that our criminal justice system would be quite different if we thought of it as reproving the offender rather than as paying him back for what he did. That was about corrective justice, its nature and importance. Now, secondly, primary justice. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that it's been my experience when talking about justice to audiences consisting mainly of Christians, that when it's clear that the topic is not corrective justice, but primary justice, the response I often receive is that the Christian gospel is about love. It's not about justice. The second of the two great commands is love your neighbor as yourself, not treat the neighbor justly. I also mentioned that churches almost always have benevolence committees, but rarely have social justice committees. So I'm going to frame my question here like this. Why isn't love, charity, benevolence enough? Why justice? Why isn't charity, love, benevolence enough? So now let me describe for you the experience that first forcefully brought home to me that love, benevolence, charity are not enough. Some of you have heard me describe this experience on other occasions, so once again, if you have, hope you'll put up with it. It happened in September 1975 when I was sent by Calvin College, where I was teaching philosophy, to an international conference on Christian higher education, organized by the Christian University of Potchefstroom in South Africa, a small to medium-sized city located, as I recall, about an hour's drive from Johannesburg. Most of the South Africans at the conference were white Afrikaners. There may also have been a few English South Africans I don't happen to remember. But there were also some so-called blacks and colored people from South Africa present at the conference. In addition, there was a sizable contingent from the Netherlands, and a few of us from North America, from Asia, and so forth. Though the conference was not about the South African system of apartheid, as you might have guessed, was the dominant topic of conversation during meal breaks, coffee breaks, meals, and so forth. And it constantly threatened to intrude into the conference itself. Finally, in one session, it did. And then the organizers said, well, let's not talk about it in these scheduled sessions, but let's schedule an extra late at night session, about 10 o'clock in the evening, as I recall. The discussion at that evening session was more intense than anything I'd ever experienced before. I think it may be more intense than anything I've ever experienced since as well. The Dutch delegates were very well informed about South Africa. They knew the language. Afrikaans is a derivative of Dutch, and a Dutchman can easily understand it. They were very well informed about South Africa, and they were very angry about apartheid, and they vented their anger at the Afrikaners. And the Afrikaner defenders of apartheid, in turn, not all of them did defend apartheid, but those who did, in turn, vented their anger at the Dutch. I learned later that the Afrikaners usually responded to criticism by saying, "But you don't understand." They couldn't say that to the Dutch. So instead they said, "Why are you so self-righteously judgmental?" Eventually the coloreds and the blacks began to speak up from South Africa, more in tones of hurt than of anger to my ear at the time, though I'd want to let them say whether my ear was correct. They described the indignities daily heaped upon them and the many ways in which they were demeaned. Blancs align, whites only, and so forth. And as to apartheid, they described the ways in which they were expelled from their ancestral homes all over South Africa, urban South Africa, Cape Town and so forth, Johannesburg, and herded off into Bantustans up north. And with great passion, they cried out for justice. The response by the Afrikaners at the conference, who spoke up in defense of apartheid, to this cry for justice, took me completely aback. I expected them to contest the charge of injustice. They did not. Instead, they insisted that justice was not a relevant category. Benevolence was the relevant category, an order. The whole project of apartheid, you see, they said, was at bottom an act of goodwill on the part of the ruling Afrikaners. In South Africa, they explained, there are some 10 or 11 different nationalities. Depends a bit on how you're going to count nationalities, some 10 or 11 different nationalities. And the system of apartheid was inspired by the great visionary ideal of each of these nationalities finding its own cultural identity. Now, if that was to happen, each finding its own cultural identity, they couldn't all be mingled through each other. They had to be pulled apart, hence apartheid. In short, the Afrikaners presented themselves as a benevolent people. And they added stories about the secondhand clothes that their own children had worn out that they gave to the black families living in the backyard, about the little gifts they gave at Christmas, and so forth. They were, they said, a benevolent people. And they complained that so often their benevolence went unacknowledged. No gratitude was forthcoming. I shall never forget one of them, a woman, up on the platform asking plaintively, "Why can't we just love each other? Why do you only criticize us? Is it loving of you to just criticize us?" And they complained that the critics of apartheid neglected the visionary ideal that inspired it, only focused on the difficulties on the road towards that visionary ideal. So what I saw before my eyes, as I'd never seen before, was benevolence being used as an instrument of oppression. Self-perceived benevolence, of course. And at the same time, I saw why justice, primary justice, is important. So let me put it like this. Justice, I saw, puts a brake, B-R-A-K-E. Justice puts a brake on the evils inflicted by paternalistic and authoritarian benevolence. Over and over, we human beings have the vision of some good, sometimes some great good, that can be achieved by doing one and another thing to our fellow human beings. And over, we ride roughshod over our fellow human beings in order to attain that good. Lenin and Stalin had a vision of a great good, supposed great good, that would be achieved by communist society. The brake of justice was absent. And so some 20 million Russians were killed for the sake of the cause. Hitler believed that some great good would be achieved if Europe could be rid of the Jews. The brake of justice was absent. And so some 6 million Jews were slaughtered for the sake of the cause. And the same thing happens in smaller situations. Example, a student in my class does a bang-up job. He deserves an A. But he's cocky. And I think that a B- would serve the cause of character reformation, do him good. If the break of justice is absent, I give him a B-. I've never done that, but I had a colleague tell me that he once did exactly this. And need I tell you that the same thing happens all too often in how parents treat their children. So let me say it again. Justice puts a brake on the harm wreaked by paternalistic and authoritarian benevolence. And of course it puts a brake also on the harm wreaked by anger, vengeance, and the like. It puts a brake on torture used as an instrument of punishment. How does justice do that? Well, my view is that justice, as I said, is grounded in rights, that there's justice present in society insofar as people enjoy what they have a right to. And I hold in turn that rights are grounded in worth or dignity. You've got a right to my treating you a certain way, just in case if I didn't treat you that way, I wouldn't be treating you as befits your worth, your dignity. The Afrikaners only thought of the great good that apartheid would supposedly bring about. It never occurred to them to think of the indignity that they were perpetrating on the blacks and the colors. Or if it did occur to them, they put it out of mind. And Hitler, we know, thought that the Jews had no dignity. That's why he thought they could be killed for the sake of some great good. I've just reread Uncle Tom's Cabin. Wonderful book. I'd forgotten how wonderful it is. The 19th century Southern American slave owners didn't think that the blacks had any dignity. That's why they thought that they could be put up on the block for sale. Think of it like this. When I see myself acting out of benevolence, I'm calling the shots, right? I decide where to focus my benevolence and what form it'll take. And if you don't like it, that's your problem. I'm doing you good, or I'm doing somebody good. But when you see yourself as acting as justice requires, the worth and the dignity of the other calls the shots. You are decentered, as it were. You're a listener rather than a talker. Tonight I have only incidentally talked about Scripture. If I had 30 minutes more, I would talk a good deal about Scripture, but I don't have 30 minutes more. Let me just say this, though. The theme of justice runs all through the Old Testament and on into the New, which would be more clear to us if we read our Bibles in any of the Romance languages, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and so forth, rather than English. I think there's a deep reason why justice runs deep in the Christian Scriptures. What we learn already from the second chapter of Genesis is that human beings have the great worth of being created in God's image. And what we learn loud and clear from the New Testament is that they also have the great worth of being loved by God. I submit that the reason justice is so prominent in Scripture is, at bottom, the fact that human worth, dignity, is so prominent in Christian Scripture. And finally, and all too briefly, you may want to ask questions, make proposals on this score. How do you and I apply this to our lives? First of all, we apply it in the fine texture of our lives. As parents, as teachers, as administrators, whatever. That student who did a bang-up job in my class but could use some character formation. He deserves an A. He has the worth of having done A-level work in my course. If I don't give him an A, I wrong him. So what do? I give him an A and try to find other ways to induce character reformation. Beyond that, there are justice organizations all around us in which people are working cooperatively for justice.
My advice is pick one or two for your support, on which to concentrate your support. Pick those that touch your heart. Pick those that seem to be especially needy of support. As it turns out, the work of IJM, International Justice Mission, against human trafficking, as it turns out, has extraordinary appeal. Money comes rolling in.
The work of ASJ has considerably less appeal. Support ASJ. Support the Micah Center here in the city. Remember the blessings that Jesus spoke in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to translate them as I think they should be translated. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of justice, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.